Welcome to Proud Theology Revisited. This August is Pride Month in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we are excited to be contributing to that virtual celebration by re-airing our 2019 series, Proud Theology. This July 30th, we will kick off that 4-part series with a special 5th bonus episode featuring Mary, a member of our community who contributes much love and knowledge to this ever-evolving conversation. So make sure you tune in with us as we revisit this very pertinent conversation together. As always, we do offer some trigger warnings. There is mention of homophobia and transphobia and how that contributes to violence against bodies. And so please take care of yourselves while you listen. I hope that through this conversation, we can expand your theological libraries, but we can also widen our God talk as we continue to strive to be diverse and inclusive in our language, in our theology, and our relationship with one another. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Awakening Shalom podcast. The Awakening Shalom podcast is an opportunity for digital faith formation at Myers Park Baptist Church that accompanies the Awakening series, a year-long journey of exploration and discernment which invites all people to come learn about the current social justice issues of the day and how they impact our faith. What we are awakening to is Shalom, the Hebrew word for the peace and beauty that exists when we are living in right relationship with God, ourselves, other human beings, and all created things.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Proud Theology. This is our episode number 2.
That's right.
Right? We're in the studio. I am Mia McLean, and I'm here with
Ben Boswell.
And let's jump right in. We had a great episode last week. We talked a lot about how we came to our own definitions of what queer was, and some of the things we were taught as children that kind of aren't what it is now. And just kind of discussing the word, the evolution of the word, and why we chose to name this episode Proud Theology as opposed to Queer Theology.
Right.
But we also talked a little bit about identifying ourselves as we begin the conversation. And I know Ben has been working with a team of folks who have created a wonderful website called Identiversity.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yes, it is a fabulous website. I've already recommended it to a few people. I'm learning we're all on this journey of becoming more aware.
That's right.
As we enter into dialogue with different people.
Yeah, that's right. And I was actually at the Pride Interfaith Worship Service, which was Sunday, because we were in Pride Week. Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride.
And we'll be marching in the Pride Parade. For those who are listening, you can come join us, and we'll have a table out on Saturday and marching in the parade on Sunday. And finding out from some folks at the Pride Interfaith Service that a lot of communities, not just ours, are struggling with this age gap that we talked about last time between young LGBTQ folks and an older generation that has never heard about pansexual, asexual, cis, het, all that stuff, and doesn't know the language. And so that's actually a great reason for this Identiversity website, so that everybody can come to a common ground. It's also why we're doing the podcast.
Yeah.
Is to bridge the generation gap on this and the gap within the community so that we can all be allies with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So as usual, I would like to open with a quote. Last week we had a wonderful quote from Marlon Riggs. This week, the quote is, "Once you have dialogue starting, you know you can break down prejudice." That is by the late Harvey Milk. Many of you are familiar with who that is, but if you aren't, Harvey Milk was a New York native, found his voice as a leader and activist in San Francisco during the 70s. It was a time when the community was encountering widespread hostility and discrimination. Milk was one of the first openly gay elected officials in the United States. He won a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977 after 2 previous unsuccessful attempts. As many of you know, Milk was assassinated. in 78, I believe. And so, if you ever go to San Francisco and go into the downtown area, you will see many monumental landmarks that are really praising Milk's work. And of course, there was a movie.
Yeah, it was a movie with Sean Penn.
Yeah.
Starring as Harvey Milk, and it was a great movie.
Yeah.
Great movie. It helped kind of introduce me to Harvey Milk and his story. I thought it was a fantastic film. Great quote this morning.
Yeah, because we're talking about dialogue, and I was talking to a church member here recently, and she listened to the podcast, and she talked about one of her friends having a non-binary child, and really not knowing how to engage with that person. And the podcast was the beginning of her doing the work, and she was like, "I feel so far behind." I'm like, "Well, it's the dialogue. You're starting somewhere, and there are people who aren't even having the dialogue, and it's the dialogue that it's the first step to breaking down these barriers."
Right. I mean, just the desire to listen to this podcast, we should affirm you for even turning this on and taking the time to devote an hour of your day to thinking about this. That is so important. It shows that you care.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that's so hard. There's a group of people who just don't care, and they're not going to do the work. And then there's a group that really just wants to know, and they don't want to keep finding themselves in situations where they say the wrong words or they hurt people unintentionally. They're really good human beings. They just want to do the right thing. So we want to affirm your efforts to get educated and to find out how you can be a better ally, how you can be in deeper relationship with people who are identifying in different ways.
Yeah.
So that's the goal of this, is educational around that. And as you already mentioned, this is impacting people's lives. This is changing their relationships with their kids, their grandkids, their brothers and sisters, their parents. This is huge.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And I'm glad we're having it this month, especially. As you know, it is Pride Month in Charlotte.
It's Pride.
Yes, and we are donating our loose plate offering to Time Out Youth, which I gave a shout out last week. But we also do work with other organizations in Charlotte. So tell us a little bit about that, Ben.
Yes, well, Time Out Youth works specifically with LGBTQ youth, but we also have another organization that we have been a long-time partner with from the very beginning of the organization, and that is RAIN. And I want to talk a little bit about RAIN. Many of you who are listening to this podcast will know RAIN was started by one of our members, Debbie Warren, who is the executive director and continues to serve there. And the vision of RAIN is to end HIV in our community, and their mission is to empower people living with HIV and those at risk to be healthy and stigma-free. And so I think why RAIN is important to this podcast is not just the connection to HIV, with HIV to the LGBTQ community throughout the history of HIV, particularly in the 80s, which we've referenced some things around that, but also continuing onward. RAIN has always been an advocate of the LGBTQ community in the city of Charlotte. And many of our strongest LGBTQ members are active in RAIN and have been for the entirety. Many members of our church helped Debbie in the founding of RAIN, and we continue to be one of the largest groups that participate as members in the RAIN Breakfast, and also our church is the largest faith community financial sponsor of RAIN.
Yes.
Pretty much every year. One year the Presbyterians at Caldwell got us, but we got back. We came back last year. So
that's right.
We're very proud of that fact, even if we lose to the Presbyterians again sometime, which we're not going to this year. But if we did, we care deeply about RAIN, and our support for them continues to be just one part of our outreach and advocacy for the LGBTQ community. I think the word stigma is the word that is so powerful. And so that's how RAIN gets into not just stigma around HIV, which is its own problem, but stigma around LGBTQ folks related to HIV and other issues. So, we're always there to march in the AIDS Walk every year, and we continue to be big supporters of RAIN. So we throw out just a shout out. We're going to continue to shout out to other LGBTQ organizations as we go through the podcast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we dive into the conversation, I do want to make note that we are speaking from 3 different books with 3 different authors. And the reason is we just couldn't settle on one book to have this conversation.
Yes.
It's so deeply enriching, but also the perspectives that people are coming from are very different.
Yes.
And so as you listen, please listen as we not so much are comparing and contrasting, but we're offering up what these authors have to say from their varying perspectives.
Yeah.
So last week we talked a little bit about what queer was in our introduction to queerness.
We did.
Yes. And so we didn't get to the second part of the word of queer theology of the term. And so I want to talk a little bit about theology as well. I was talking to somebody else in the congregation who said they didn't really understand these kind of compacted terms when you say theology, systematic theology, process theology, liberation. They don't understand what the first word is as it relates to the second word.
Wow. Okay.
And so we'll get into that a little bit. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to identify myself. I don't think I did that last week. You did it last week.
I did? Okay.
Yeah.
It's your turn.
It's my turn. So I am a cisgender heterosexual woman person. I think my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Okay.
And I like to call myself an ally, but I feel like I don't. The community gets to decide whether you're an ally.
What does ally mean?
What does it mean?
That's an important part of our podcast, especially for us as cis-het people, right, talking about this issue. That needs to be a part of our discussion is what does it mean to be ally?
Yeah.
I think so. I like the way you said that others determine whether you're an ally or not.
Yeah.
And you can't just proclaim yourself an ally.
Right.
And I think there's a difference between like ally, advocate, safe person, right, on the journey. There's all sorts of stuff, you know. I don't consider myself an ally in the same way I think about race. Like I don't consider myself an ally to the black community. I am anti-racist. And that's my work. Yeah. Whenever I see racism, I'm anti that. Yeah. And I have to continue on this journey of always continuing to identify different forms of racism, kinds of it, but I'm anti it whenever I see it. Yeah. In the same way, like my role in relationship to the LGBTQ community is to be anti-homophobia whenever I see it. Yeah. And anti-normativity. Yeah. Right. As a hegemonic idea. Yeah. Like, this is the way you have to be male, female, gay, whatever,
Right.
straight. There's only these categories and there's nothing else. And whenever I see that kind of homophobia or limitations, I'm against that. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good way to put that. Or particularly people who are being discriminated against because of their identity, sexual identity or gender identity. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great way to put anti-something.
Yeah.
Anti-something.
I'm anti that. I mean, I'm also pro, like, LGBTQ people. Right. But, like, my way of being pro is not the same way they're pro, right? Because I'm in a different community and have a different identity, so I don't expect my pro to be their pro. Yeah. I do what I can, right? But I also, part of my work is to educate on overcoming homophobia, which I see as an evil system.
It is. And it's something that I came to this, I guess, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine who was a black gay man, and he's always like, Mia, you're so passionate about the cause more than some people in the actual community. Yeah. But it's just something that, you know, growing up as in an artist community and having people around me who lost a lot of friends to AIDS, and it wasn't just the virus, but the way those friends were treated, I just feel in my bones that it's a life's work as well to be the person, to be a safe space. If I can, as safe as I can be. Yeah,
and I guess I didn't mention last time, sort of tied to my identity has been this constant wrestling with what does allyship look like, particularly for a cisgendered heterosexual man who is in charge or empowered to be a leader of these large, important church organizations. And so in my previous settings, that has meant leading churches to become welcoming, affirming that weren't already. And I've done that work at 2 previous churches. Thank God I came here and they'd already done that because it's very hard work and it's challenging. And you lose people and you get personally attacked by those who have very negative feelings toward it or think theologically that you're throwing the Bible out or whatever. But it's incredibly rewarding and important work for the church. And every time that I've done that, it's engaged me in pastoral relationships with people in the LGBTQ community who are on their own journey of identity discovery or coming out of the closet or struggling with family. And so I've been able to engage in pastoral relationships with people in the LGBTQ community as well. And there's that has been a huge learning. So I was trained on none of that at Duke, 0 in seminary, training on how to do pastoral care. with the LGBTQ community. Not even half a class,
Wow.
not an article.
Not a lecture? Nothing?
Not a lecture. Nothing. And it wasn't because people weren't thinking about that there. It was because the pastoral care classes were limited in that way.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot of discussion about queer theory at Duke.
Yeah.
But I've come to do a lot of research on that since, and also have my own lived experience related to that. And then also time as a chaplain, being with people who are diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. I've had to be there with doctors when they tell people that they've have been diagnosed with HIV, which is a really, really hard process. But to try to help them understand this is not a death sentence, and to walk with them and provide some kind of hope and compassion in the midst of that situation. So there's a pastoral side to all of this discussion as well, in addition as what does it look like for a church to walk through this discussion, which Myers Park has, and a lot of other churches have. And then there's a whole group of denominations that did, and then denominations right now need to.
Yeah.
Hint Methodist.
Yeah.
And then there's also all kinds of individual issues with it too, as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of learning.
A lot of learning, always.
Fast learning, yes.
So, what is theology? Now, we've kind of.
I'm going to go back to the good womanist. And actually, even before womanists, I think there's also some feminists that use this definition, is just that theology is God talk.
Okay.
It is thought. I don't think it's God thinking too. It's thought or talk about God and things related to God. That's the basic definition. Now, of course, as a discipline. As an academic discipline, because everybody's a theologian,
right?
Anybody who's ever thought about God,
right,
or ever talked about God, even if they're an atheist, they are an atheist theologian. So there is an egalitarian definition that we're giving out, and I love that womanists have retaken that and don't use the term theology as much. They use God talk, right? So like you're thinking about Sisters in the Wilderness, right, by Dolores Williams. So, but then, as an academic discipline, theology has a whole nother history of what is theology.
Right.
And what is the distinction between, say, theology and philosophy. Or theology and just other theories, critical theory, critical race theory, or critical, any of the other critical theories that are out there. And I think the difference, and there are a lot of distinctions on this, so this is not a perfect definition, but I think some people would say that when you begin to imagine the relationship, when you begin to describe in writing or in word the relationship of God to the world or to people in your writings, you are moving from philosophy into theology.
Okay.
And that can be done by people of any different set of beliefs. I remember when Reza Aslan wrote that book, Jesus Zealot, and he was being interviewed on Fox News, and somebody said, "Why are you, a Muslim, writing a book about Jesus? This is just crazy." And Reza's like, "I'm an academic scholar who studies early Christianity, and I happen to be a practicing Muslim. I'm fine to write a book on Jesus.
That's right.
Just like atheist Bart Ehrman, who teaches at Chapel Hill, doesn't profess faith but writes a lot on Jesus. And if we have to have a litmus test of faith for everybody who writes a book on Jesus, we're going to have a problem. You know? And there's a lot of books written on Jesus by people who say they're Christian that I would not call Christian, right? So this is this idea of what's the difference. Where does the personal life of a person end and their theology or philosophy begin? That's a whole other podcast. So I think you move into that when you start to begin to think about God and God's relationship to humanity and the world, and when you start talking about things that are outside the disciplines of physics and science. Of course, there are a lot of people writing about how science and theology are actually twins.
They're very close.
Way more closely related than we think.
Yeah.
So there's not fine lines between these things.
Right. And so this is interesting because when we were brainstorming about this podcast, you were calling it queer theory and I was calling it queer theology. Is there even a line in between the two of those, right? Like, can you actually have a conversation about queer theory without talking about the historical nature of Christianity and its effects on queer theory? I mean,
isn't all this coming from some place that's rooted in unpacking the entanglement of faith and sexuality?
Well, some would argue that there's no distinction between sacred or secular either, so there's no way to do anything that's not theological, or vice versa, right? There's no way to talk about a chair without being theological, because we're theological beings who are. And so I don't know if I want to go that far, but I do want to say that I don't think the lines between queer theory and queer theology are real hard and fast. But I do think queer theology is born from queer theory.
Okay.
And relies a lot on queer theory for its foundations. And so we need to go back to queer theory and look at that a little bit before we understand where queer theology is coming from. So just to break this for folks, there are no theologies that don't have some kind of philosophical foundation, or oftentimes foundationalism, which is a bad thing. And I say that because, Christians for centuries have argued with each other and not realized that the reason they're arguing is because they're relying on different philosophical foundations to argue about their theology. So I'll give you an example. Most of Jesus' teachings are based in Jewish philosophy and theology, right? Both. And you can talk about what you think the difference between Jewish philosophy and theology is. But almost everything Jesus says, but almost all the writers after Jesus are really wrestling with how to adapt Jesus' teachings to their Greco-Roman philosophical environment. So they're
Aristotle.
bathed in Aristotle and Plato, a lot of Plato.
Yeah.
The Neoplatonists are out there influencing the Gnostics, influencing everybody. And so Augustine is bringing in like just war theory from Roman jurisprudence, which is Roman law, and baptizing it and making it Christian. Now, was it really Christian? No.
Yeah.
Jesus had no interest in just war. He was a pacifist, right? So you bring this theory in to try to help you make sense of theology in this new environment. And there's a lot of that with Aristotle. So Aquinas basically synthesizes Aristotle and Augustine together to make his theory. And so liberation theology, a lot of that originates from Marxist philosophical theory, Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. And then liberation theology is born out of and in conversation and dialogue with Marxist philosophy. And so queer theory is what is sort of the philosophical foundation of queer theology, just so people kind of understand that almost all theologies have some philosophical roots to them, which is why most theologians also study philosophy and vice versa. And a lot of philosophers are also theologians and vice versa. So there's a lot of interplay between the two. And I think we need to recognize that, because there are a lot of people who are very I would say rigid about what philosophies can be used to ground Christian theory and Christian theology. So I was at Catholic University. I studied there during my PhD, and I took a class on liberation theology while I was there. And the whole time in the class, the professor tried to destroy liberation theology by saying that it had a Marxist philosophical foundation. So one day I said, hey, all your favorite Catholic theologians that are not liberation theologians, let me point out what their philosophies are. It's Aristotle here, and Plato, and you should go through and show them. And I said, I just asked them, why is Aristotle better than Marx? And they don't have an answer for that. Right. So that's what we have to ask ourselves when we come into this. Why is Aristotle better than Michel Foucault? He's not. Foucault has many books where he destroys Aristotle. So, I mean, there's not you can't elevate one philosopher over another. You can, but you have to understand that you're doing so with subjectivity.
And so philosophy is sort of a seeking of understanding, and theology is faith-seeking understanding, which is the famous definition that I can't remember who said it first, but people call theology a faith-seeking understanding. And so it's kind of building off an already a journey of seeking that's already in existence.
Right, that's right. Yeah, and you're adding this element of faith to your you're kind of combining faith and reason when you're doing theology. Yeah. You're taking the reason of philosophy, good philosophical theories, critical theory, queer theory, Aristotelian philosophy, post-critical philosophers, right, like Michel Foucault, and then you're combining faith with that, and you're dialoguing together, and that's kind of where the theology and the philosophy come together.
Wow. Okay.
We're on kind of a philosophical kick with people, but that helps them get into what when you read these books, you have to see that queer theory jumps out at you right out of the beginning. So we can kind of look at that as we try to get our definition of because the definitions of what queer is come from queer theory, and then they bring them into queer theology.
Yes.
So we have to wrestle with those early definitions that they have in queer theory that Michel Foucault and others, Judith Butler, bring up about what does it mean to be queer, and because that then helps to shape the way in which queer theologians understand queerness.
But do you think that this work is a backwards work? Because most people that I know of who have gone into kind of researching queer theology, either for themselves or because they're on whatever journey they're on with making a church open and affirming, they've started with theology and had to work their way backwards.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's true? I mean,
I think that that's a really good point, because that gets into what Tonstad in her book is trying to get us to wrestle with is how are we building queer theologies?
Right.
And the way you described is the way that most people end up there, is that they're struggling with their own identity or the identity of someone they love, and so they see
in relation to faith.
In their relationship to faith, because it's usually happening that they've been excluded from a church,
right,
or the church is telling them they're wrong,
right.
So they're struggling with it in relationship to the church and faith and preaching and all that, and then they say, well, wait a second, and then they go and try to find other resources that have undercut or re-described biblical passages, theologians, and Tonstad will call that apologetics.
Yeah.
Most queer theology is developed as apologetics, which is what we see. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's how it comes. It's trying to apologize for or describe why what you've heard about LGBTQ people in relationship to faith is wrong, right? It's trying to respond to the critics.
Yeah.
And so so Tonstad wants us to go the other way.
She wants us to start with.
Yeah. She wants us to assume queer people should be included in the church, never having wondered whether they couldn't, and not really worried about those biblical passages.
Yeah. And
go back and start with queerness as an idea, and work our way the other direction. Yeah. And I think there are pros and cons to both approaches.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about Tonstad a little bit since we're here. Early on in the book, which is called Queer Theology.
Yep.
Early on in the book, Tonstad gives us a definition of what many assume queer theology to be. And it says, queer theology indicates theologies in which, 1, sexuality and gender are discussed, and 2, in ways that affirm, represent, or apologize for queer persons. Which is kind of getting into what I always thought it was. Yeah. Kind of a working back from theology to philosophy, and not the other way, which Tonstad is revealing to us as we read this book, the way that it might be best for us to work. Yes. A way in which queerness is the normative, and not, and we're not trying to apologize for queerness as it relates to our heteronormative culture.
Yeah, so I think Tonstad, I love that, because I think Tonstad would say, every time you try to apologize, if your book starts with the fact that, like, Christians have been exclusive of gay people or exclusive of LGBTQ people and queer people, so let's look at that and understand what that's about. So you can do a sociological study to understand, most homophobia develops as the hatred of women. And whether they're hating gay men who are more effeminate or women who are not playing their role, it's always the hatred of women that's the origination of homophobia, right? And so you can go back and look at it from a sociological perspective, or you can go back to all those biblical passages, the clobber passages, the nine or whatever, and you can read them differently, right? Just like yesterday, I heard Bishop Rawls talk about Sodom and Gomorrah and say, no, that wasn't the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah as it's says in Ezekiel and many other places throughout the Bible, including Jesus, had nothing to do with sexuality, but was about hospitality. They were inhospitable. They couldn't find even one righteous person there besides Lot who wouldn't kill and rape people. And by the way, rape has nothing to do with LGBTQ sexuality.
No, it's about power.
Rape is about power and war.
Yeah.
That's how you make war on your enemies.
Yeah.
And so this idea that they wanted to rape them has nothing to do with sexuality or gender at all. It's really about hospitality. And so who's the real sodomites, Bishop Rawls says? America refusing to allow people into its borders without killing them or harming them. We are sodomites. America is sodomites. We're the judged ones, right?
Wow.
So she flips it on its head. So there are theologians who then do that with every scriptural passage. And then there are others who do it with theologians. Like I've heard Eugene Rogers' book that really had an impact on me is he takes Barth and Aquinas and he says, actually in their own terms, if they had followed the logical conclusions of their own thought, would it be welcoming and affirming? It's really interesting the way he kind of does that.
Yeah.
So that's all the apologetics. But then Tonstad kind of wants to say, you're really starting with the assumption that queerness is not normative when you do that. Like queerness is somehow an anomaly.
Yeah.
That it's not. It shouldn't be thought of as dominant. It shouldn't have its own place. It's an aberration. Which sounds a lot like abomination, right?
Yeah.
Like it's, and so she, in her sort of theological assessment at when she talks about these apologetic strategies is that they're not really that rich theologically, and they start from they depend on these conditions, like we're saying, oh, well, Christianity has excluded gay people for so long. Let's try to apologize for that to see if we can find a way for people to be either nicer to them, include them more. And it's always this in this apologetic form instead of starting with this concept of, okay, queerness is real.
Yeah.
It's here. What is it? And how do we develop a theory, a system around it to understand what it means, how it's operating, starting with it as real and present and not an aberration.
Yeah, and I like how Tonstad actually talked about how we got from one sex to two sexes, and how that previously people who were called women were still considered one sex. There wasn't a distinction. They were just considered something, an inferior version of the one sex.
Of the one sex, that's right.
And then we moved from that to two sexes, which then created this distinction that has, of course, been very harmful to people who identify as non-binary or trans. And I thought that was so fascinating because it seems like queerness was the norm. Queerness was the dominant way of being. And we kind of, because of empire and some other things, moved away from that. And then heteronormativity became the thing. Right. That's right. Yeah. And I think that's really helpful because so Tonstad's trying to say that queerness might be primary. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Not an aberration, but it was there first and then we ignored it. Heteronormativity is the aberration, is the imperial dominant form of Western sexual and gender identity that is imposed upon as oppressive to original queerness. Right. Right. It would, so yesterday, I'm bringing up Bishop Rawls' sermon again. Bishop Rawls blew everybody's mind yesterday when she said, when God created Adam or Adam, right? God created a person. God didn't create two genders. God created one gender, right? Or God created one person. This person. And she went on this whole tirade about how Adam was a woman. And which I thought was great, and the reason I thought it was great is because I went to a conference and that was incredibly transformative for me. And while I was there, I learned in my studies that all people start when they are conceived as women. Every one of us was, no matter what we are now, how we identify or what we look like or what our genitalia is, or how our bodies are, started as women, and then we get a shot of androgen, and dependent upon how large that shot of androgen is, the things form differently. Like the ovaries turn into gonads and the clitoris turns into a penis and everything shapes out based off an original type that is the same of all.
and you get a shot of this androgen thing that happens, and that changes everything. So this idea that, so the problem with that, most people don't know that. They have no idea. They think you come in, you're already formed, and that sexuality is so static, or gender is so static, you know what you are right out of the gate, and don't realize that we're all forming with parts that are similar in certain ways from the very beginning. And that means that if we're all originally in some ways female, or have that sort of female starting point, then we're all really queer, right? Yeah. We're all in some ways queer because of that, no matter what we turned out to be. And that also begs the question, biologically about Adam. If we all start out as women, then maybe Bishop Rawls is right that Adam was a woman, and then things were taken from Adam and made into, or transitioned into, diversity out of that. Yeah. Right? And complexity out of that. And I think that's why when we talk about sexuality and gender, and this is why I love Tonstad, we're not talking about a moral revolution, which is how everybody wants to talk about sexuality and gender. I love how I can't remember who mentions this, but it's like whenever we start talking about sexuality and gender, we think that the first thing Christians need to do is figure out what are the rules for sex. Right. And what are the right gender ideas. Right. And because that's like the primary idea of what does it mean to be a Christian. And she says, that's crazy, because what we're dealing with is a scientific issue. We don't understand who we are as beings. We don't understand our sexualities. We don't understand gender. So that's why when I use the term a Copernican revolution, what we're facing is not like Copernicus was not an immoral guy. He didn't say, hey, look, because we actually don't rotate around the sun, because the sun is, we're not the center of the universe, the sun is, that's not a moral problem, that's a scientific problem. But the church interpreted it as a moral problem, right? This is the same thing here. This is a scientific discovery that we're all on, this trajectory of discovery that's happening with queerness, identity, cis, het, gender dysphoria, all the stuff that's happening, that we're coming to understand that scientifically because the culture has opened up enough for us to be able to study it. Starting with Kinsey in the 60s to now, it's been a revolution. Yeah. It's been a real sexual gender revolution in scientific study. And now we're having to come to grips with what it means for the church. And just like Copernicus and Galileo were banned from the church, anybody who tries to talk about queer theory from the scientific perspective to help people understand it becomes looked upon by the church as sinner or non-biblical. Not real Christian, just like Galileo and Copernicus and others were thought of that way. And so I really think it's helpful to think about it in terms of science. I get that. And I also think that the apologetics, the reason why they were born is because of this trying to fight the powers that be in the church. Yes. Right. So you have, we have Bishop Rawls' sermon. That's technically an apologetic, isn't it? Apologetic. Right. Yeah. And I think the reason why we needed to do that is because people were coming to us saying, well, in Leviticus 23, it says X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And so now we have to go back and say, well, actually Leviticus blah, blah, blah means this. Or what's another, the Sodom and Genesis 19. Now we have to go back and counter preach it. And so I think that the reason why apologetics was born is because we're in this society that's so hostile. And so, to be quite honest, trying to fight back. And I, in terms of the more conservative, morally conservative Christians, they're coming with these scriptures memorized. Oh yeah. Right. And we're coming with queer theory, well, actually, it's the prime. They're not listening to if it's the primary. We have to start with apologetics with that crowd. Right. That's right. There's some people who it's always going to be apologetics for. Yeah. They're never, and even the apologetics aren't going to work. Yeah. But you're right. Yeah. You have to have both in your arsenal. Yeah. I think Tonstad is trying to get us to imagine, well, if we didn't have to defend ourselves all the time, what would queer theology actually look like if it didn't have to defend itself against the onslaught of a homophobic church? Yeah. That would be it would be interesting. That's what she's trying to do in the book. So that's creative. But I think it's important for us to keep holding these kind of ideas. There's queer theory in its own formation, queer theology, and then there's sort of this apologetic form of queer theology. And then there's the Tonstad's form where she's trying to start as if that was unnecessary.
Yeah.
And what does that look like? I think we kind of hold all those in tension as we go through.
Yeah. And I think as we move from Tonstad to a few of the other authors, I think that it's important to note that for many of at least the other authors that I've read who kind of have intersectional identities and oppressions, not that Tonstad doesn't, but the others talk about their intersectional oppressions, that many are coming from apologetics first.
Yes.
They're coming to their own queer identity through some sort of apologetic process.
Right. The apologetics is what got them there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we shouldn't throw out apologetics.
Right.
Because otherwise we wouldn't even have these books.
Right.
Or queer theology at all, right?
Yeah. So if you don't know, Linn Marie Tonstad is an associate professor of systematic theology at Yale Divinity School.
Yeah.
So if you want to follow more of that work, you can look Tonstad up and get acquainted.
Absolutely. And Yale, pretty good school.
It's a pretty good. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we're not picking out slouch scholars here. Okay.
Yeah. So let's move on a little bit to talk about what some of the others might say queer theory or queer theology is as it relates to their identity. So we are also reading Patrick S. Cheng's Radical Love, an introduction to queer theology.
Yes.
And I particularly am fond of Patrick Cheng's work because he is a Union alum.
All right.
Union
Represent.
Theological Seminary, and his work grew out of sitting in Dr. James Cone's class and feeling like there was nothing that was really speaking to his theological journey as it related to his queerness.
Yes.
And you're more than welcome to give a little brief intro of him if you would like.
Well, I love Cheng. Did you already say that he teaches at Episcopal Divinity School now? Yeah.
Well, actually, he doesn't anymore.
Oh, where's he now?
Yeah, so he's an Episcopal priest.
Okay, good. Wow.
Yeah, so he's working at a church in Manhattan as like a visiting priest, visiting professor. But he was at EDS for quite some time.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that really impacted me about reading Cheng's description, I think Cheng's book is a really, really, really good introduction to thinkers and theories related to queer theory. So if you just need I just want to read an introduction to this to kind of understand what this world is all about, Cheng is the place to go. He will get you in there, and he will get you the definitions that you need quickly. He'll give you the theory. Who is the person writing on this topic? Who are they? Where did their theory come from? What are the key issues within their theory? Very helpful at that. And when he talks about queerness in relationship to queer theory and theology on pages 5 and 6 and 7 and afterwards, he uses this language of transgressive action. He calls queer, as a subtitle, transgressive action. That transgressing across boundaries is part of what it means to be queer and to do queerness. And you can even use it as a verb. To queer something is to cross boundaries.
Wow.
And I thought that was really interesting. And later he talks about queer as erasing boundaries. So sometimes it's crossing them, and then the next time it is eliminating those boundaries, which I thought is pretty cool. I mean, when he really defines queerness, though, he even goes even more basic than that and says that to queer something is to engage with a methodology that challenges and disrupts the status quo. So anytime you do something that disrupts the status quo, you could call that a queer action.
Wow.
Which really broadens this beyond gender and sexuality.
Right. This is about something else. Right.
And it's about difference. It's about non-normative difference. Highlighting the non-normativity, and bringing it to the surface. I think that what I wanted, or really struggled with as I listened to him and read him talk about this is the fact that the way we use the word transgression within Christianity. So he describes queer transgression as a positive activity, but in Christian theology, we use the word transgression negatively as sinful. And so it's the difference between sin and salvation. He's using transgression as a synonym for salvation, liberation. And we use it as a synonym for sin, the opposite of salvation and liberation. So I just want to go on a riff on that a little bit related to the Lord's Prayer, which I'm just on a kick on in general in life lately. Is we keep using the wrong words for the Lord's Prayer. Transgression is a word that is never used in the New Testament at all, ever. Sin is, iniquity is. Transgression is not a Greek term. It's an English word. And But I think some of the reasons that we like transgression is because it, in one way, kind of waters down the power of sin and debt. Debt is the original Greek, right? Matthew says debt twice. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Then Luke says, forgive us our sins, God, as we forgive our debts. So Luke says sin and debt.
Debt.
So it's debt or sin. Yeah, it's debt 3 times in the Bible. It's sin once. You pick. But it's not transgression. And so I think it's uniquely tied to Western society and capitalism, because transgression is a term that you have when you have private property. Transgression is not a word that an indigenous person would use in America.
Whoa.
Or a native person. What does it mean to transgress?
If it's not yours to begin with.
Right. The land is part of us. It's all of ours. It's nobody. It doesn't belong to anybody.
There's
it's
no ownership.
The land.
Yeah.
So once you create a category of private property, now transgression becomes a big time sin. In fact, it's legal, right? Trespassing.
Yeah.
is actually a law.
Yeah.
Right? It's something that you can do, that you can be fined for, right? It's misdemeanor or something, right? And so I think when we use transgression, we don't always think about that, but I do think that it's a sort of watered down capitalist usage of the word sin. That means don't walk on my private property.
Yeah.
Or take something that doesn't belong to you. It's like theft, or private property has been violated. So I think about that, and I just don't think that it's helpful. And particularly if we're going to be opening our minds to queer theory, we want to start using the word transgressed in a positive way, we're going to have to leave it away.
Yeah.
There's no way to use it negatively and positively. I don't know how you do that. You can't keep saying, forgive me my transgressions, when I'm transgressing things as a queer theologian.
Right.
And
so we're automatically heretics because we're transgressing.
Right.
We're challenging the status quo.
Right. We're calling what we're doing for queer theory a sin.
Yeah.
Which I don't think it is.
No.
So I wrestle with this tension. And I think that the reason I think that's really important is because when we start doing theology through either liberation theology or queer theology or post-colonial theology, it will change the theology we inherited. And it should change it in these really powerful ways. And it may change it in ways that are very complicated and hard for us, like, for instance, changing the way we recite the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to wrestle with that.
Yeah. So people might say, Ben, that you're queering the Lord's Prayer.
I'm trying to queer it up. Say
challenging the status quo of the Lord's Prayer, and people aren't going to like it.
Yeah. Well, I think hopefully that'll give people a kind of a little bit of introduction to Cheng. But he uses the word transgression in relationship to queer theory like 10 times throughout the book. I mean, so it's pretty normative.
Yeah, and even the word trans, if you go back and you read the introduction in Linn Tonstad's book, Linn talks about what that actually meant in terms of the mountainous structures and crossing over. And I would go back and read that because there's a lot of questions now that I'm thinking of kind of the first part of that word, transgression, just being trans. There's a lot of conversation about what that means. Right.
I mean, just also think about, I know this, some people are going to think that this is just really silly, but I actually think these kind of things are important. Just imagine what it feels like to be a trans person sitting in our sanctuary and hearing everybody go, forgive us our trans. And then whatever comes after is fine, but the first thing you're hearing is
forgive us for crossing boundaries.
Forgive us for having people that are trans in our society.
Yeah, forgive us for almost for changing, for being bold enough to
cross private property when there needs to be a protest. Or just the word trans, to hear it in relationship at all to sin creates this idea that you are wrong. As a person, which we know is a part of the biggest problem with what homophobia does to people.
Well, let's move into, I don't know if we mentioned that Cheng talks a lot about his identity as an Asian man as well. And we'll get more into that as we read through the rest of his work. But that's a big thing for him, to talk about his identity as a gay Asian man and the intersectionality that exist. And speaking of that, the final book of the discussion is Our Lives Matter, A Womanist Queer Theology, which is by Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who also enters the conversation talking about her intersectional identity as a Black lesbian woman. Right? I actually saw her speak in May phenomenal.
Yes.
Phenomenal history. She's just a phenomenal person who's kind of had interesting life run-ins with the law and all kinds of things, which she talks publicly about, and how her journey kind of how she's found herself in this position.
Wow.
Traditionally came from a Methodist background, of course, not really affiliated right now. But that was, very, very much has a Wesleyan background in terms of her thought.
Yeah.
But
what makes her womanist for our listeners?
So this is my wheelhouse, and I do love it. For those of you who went to J21 last year, you would have become acquainted with Dr. Ebony Marshall Terman, who is a womanist theologian.
And J21's our Jesus in the 21st Century lecture series in October. Yeah.
Yes. And so that's her wheelhouse. She's a womanist ethicist. And so she does a lot of Christian ethics work from that lens. But so basically the definition for womanism comes from Alice Walker, the beautiful novelist. Many of you know Color Purple. Yeah. That's Alice Walker. And it's a 4-part definition, which you can look up online if you would like. But the second part of the definition talks about sexuality. And it reads, a woman who loves other women sexually or non-sexually. And this has been a point of debate and tension in the womanist community for years, because there are still budding womanists who think that womanism has not attended to the issue of sexuality properly.
Yeah.
Or gender identity. Right. And it's in the definition. The definition is queer in itself, because Walker is allowing, if you watch Color Purple, you can see Walker. If you read or watch Color Purple, you can see how Walker's perspective is in the work that she does. There's queer relationship in the Color Purple. And that's who she was, and that's what she wanted to promote. But womanist theology kind of dropped the ball for many years in attending to the sexuality and gender identity portion. And this is where Dr. Lightsey enters the conversation, because she wanted to write something that attended to sexuality specifically. And so she's entering in from sort of apologetics as well.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite quotes that she has on page 4, she talks a lot about how she came to queer theory and queer theology through other Black writers who were talking about it.
Right.
And the person that she references is Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas.
Yes.
I
love Kelly Brown.
Oh, I do too. Sexuality in the Black Church was Kelly Brown Douglas's big book, one of the first womanist books to talk about sexuality. And Lightsey says, I was closeted at the time and wanted to read more about what she had to say about homosexuality. I hoped her work would help me to reconcile my relationship with the Protestant church. But more importantly, I needed to read from the pen of a Black theologian that I was not a sinner, an abomination in the eyes of God.
Very powerful. Very powerful. Thank God for Douglas.
Yes, really. Really, because that was the entry for so many of the people that I know who identify as Black and as LGBTQ. Reading Douglas's book was important for them to actually hear somebody else from a similar faith tradition say, you're not an abomination.
That's right. Yeah. And also from somebody with similar racial background to hear that.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the differences in the community on the issue of sexuality.
Yes. And so in this book, Lightsey doesn't define queer theology right away. But what she does say is that queer theology allows for possibilities beyond present understanding. That queer theology opens up what has previously been bordered and bounded as this is all that exists.
Yes.
It allows for infinite possibilities about how we can understand God and each other.
Yeah, one of the words that she uses a lot is ambiguity. That it opens space for ambiguity, particularly in the midst of already having sexual ambiguity There are ways to hold space for theological ambiguity as well. And that's tied to this. Why would you need to have ambiguity? Because things are not fixed and static, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And they're dynamic. Things change. And so it goes back to that fluidity that we talked about, that word that Cheng uses a lot. We mentioned on last podcast last week, is that, and she says this in the introduction on 22, that to identify as queer is to assert a type of fluidity in life, particularly sexuality. In fact, the fluidity of sexuality is the freedom of possibility, the possibility to be sexually attracted in multifarious ways. I think it's very interesting, this you're holding these tensions of fluidity and ambiguity. When you talk about fluidity, you mean that people, to get back to Kinsey and biology, people are not static in their sexuality or their gender throughout their life. You can say that as a basic fact in that many people become non-sexual at some point in their life.
Yeah.
Right? Or you could state that as a more complicated that everybody's on a spectrum and it's moving on that spectrum from time to time throughout their life. Right? In that spectrum, there's a gender spectrum between male and female as sort of the binaries. There's heterosexual and homosexual as the binaries on the sexuality spectrum. There's even an attraction spectrum. There are these places, and we are constantly in flux.
Yeah.
Right? Always moving and shaping because we're organisms that are growing all the time, right? We're alive. So we're not going to just stop in one place. And most of theology is built around this static concept of gender and a static concept of sexuality that does not ever move. And so I think when you start thinking about queer, you're saying gender isn't static. Sexuality isn't static.
Yeah.
We're all more fluid and dynamic.
Yeah. And what I love about her work, Lightsey's work, is that as far as my knowledge is concerned, it's the first full book that is just centering a womanist theology that is queer.
Yeah.
Usually there's a chapter, there's a few sentences, there's a conversation, but she really opens this topic up. And she starts by referencing other women who have talked about this. But, she's really trailblazing in this, because this is not something that you hear or find frequently in Black church communities.
No. And she's bringing it all kind of together in one place, synthesizing all the thoughts, all the authors, the Alice Walkers, the Baldwins, the Polly Murrays, all the people out there have existed in the past.
Yeah, Lorraine Hansberry.
Right, bringing them into one space so that people can connect their ideas together.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I think we've got three really different and interesting authors who are writing and are still alive, which is what we're trying to do here, because we talked about that generation gap before. If we picked some more theologians who are either retired or are deceased and have passed on, that won't help us advance the conversation from where we feel like we got stuck in time 20 years ago, and we need to keep accelerating our conversation around sexuality and gender.
Absolutely. So before we head away, I would like to just kind of talk a little bit about why does this matter for people who don't identify as queer?
Okay.
And it's a question.
Back to the ally question.
It's back to the ally question, but somebody may listen to this and say, oh, I don't need to buy these books. Oh, this is not for me.
Yeah.
What is it about this conversation that is so crucial that whatever your identity is, you need to be reading Our Lives Matter, or you need to be reading Radical Love or Queer Theology? What is it that makes this not just for queer folk to listen in on?
Yeah. You want me to answer?
I mean, you can start. I mean, I have some ideas. I mean, I can start as well. I mean, I talk about the conversation I had yesterday with a congregant who said, my friend's child is non-binary, so this is very helpful for me to listen in on. But even from maybe you don't know anybody, or you don't think you know anybody. So why would you think this is important? And we've had some people inquire about why we're doing this who don't feel like this is important to them.
How is this relevant to my life?
To my life.
I'm not a queer person.
Right.
So, I hope we're showing that queerness isn't just about sexuality and gender.
Yeah.
I think if anything, Tonstad is going to teach us that.
Yeah.
But even Cheng talks about that a lot. and Lightsey too. I mean, it's not just gender and sexuality. Queerness is about, speaking against the status quo, whatever is normative, and creating an opportunity for there to be more ambiguity, where people can be heard and where there's a different way of thinking. So in that way, a lot of us are connecting to queerness. But I think even the most important thing is just general empathy. I mean, you may not be, neither you or I are queer, but we're doing this podcast because we have relationships with queer people in our lives who we love. Yeah. There are children, teenagers, there are adults, friends, grandparents, church members, people in your neighborhood, people you work with. This may be the most important one. And some of you are running prominent businesses throughout the city, or work in prominent businesses and banks and law firms and all sorts of different places throughout the city. And you are working with queer people. So don't you want to know how to empathize with them and understand how to be a good either employer or friend or just in relationship, neighbor, a good neighbor. Love your neighbor. This is how you love your neighbor. You learn about your neighbor so that you know how to love them better. Yeah. And that's what I think people need to listen to this podcast. Yeah. And just read it.
I think that it also just gives us permission to question and to challenge the status, like you said, the status quo, to transgress. Yeah. And I think that's important because the world is evolving at a rapid pace. And if we're going to keep up, we're going to have to start challenging some of the systems that were put in place, even the ones we like, even the traditions that we like. Exactly. And it gives us permission to say, hold on, there's something more to this. Yeah. That we have not even tapped into yet. And science has already clued us into that. But it's time for theology and our theological conversations in churches to catch up.
To catch up with science, which the church is going to be doing for the rest of humanity. Yeah. And I also think, there may be a teenage transgender or LGBTQ youth out there that turns this podcast on and is in the closet. And needs to understand who they are and needs permission to know and to learn how to love themselves and to come out of the closet and to be who they really are and embrace their identity. And maybe this gives that one thing that they need, the information that they need to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Well, I think this wraps up our convo for the day, our episode 2. Please share, tell your friends about it, make sure they listen.
That's right.
And we will be back next week with episode 3.
Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride.